Let's begin by looking at the endocrine system and looking at what glands are affiliated with the endocrine system. First of all, the endocrine system is going to consist of ductless endocrine glands that are scattered throughout the body. And so these glands are going to secrete hormones that travel through the blood to their target cells. And so target cells have special receptors that bind with a specific hormone, and so that's going to regulate or direct particular functions. And so one single endocrine gland then can produce multiple hormones. However, a single hormone may be secreted by more than one endocrine gland. And so that being said, a hormone can have more than one target, and where a single target cell may be influenced also by more than just one hormone. And so the same chemical messenger may be considered a hormone or a neurotransmitter depending on the source and the mode of delivery for the cell. And so when we look here, this figure is showing that some glands and organs might only be of endocrine function, and so that includes the pituitary, parathyroid, thyroid, and adrenal glands. However, some organs can function as both for the endocrine system and non-endocrine system. And so mixed function here in the green represents like the hypothalamus, has a lot to do with neurotransmitter release as well as with hormones. The thymus, the heart, stomach, pancreas, duodenum of the small intestine, the kidneys, the skin, the ovaries in females, placenta in pregnant females, and testes in males. And then also complete function that is still unknown for the pineal gland. However, it does play a role in hormonal regulation, so it is part of the endocrine system. So some of the functions of the endocrine system include the regulation of organic metabolism, as well as water and electrolyte balance. Also, we have to induce adaptive changes that help the body cope with stressful situations. And so the endocrine system also promotes a smooth sequential growth and development, where it also helps to control reproduction. Thus, like once we all hit puberty. And then also is important for red blood cell production and helps to regulate that. And then lastly, it works with the autonomic nervous system in controlling and integrating both circulation and the digestion and absorption of foods. So there are different classifications of hormones, and so let's begin by looking at the hydrophilic or the polar hormone structure. And so these are going to be water soluble because they are hydrophilic, water loving. And so these though cannot pass through the plasma membrane, and they must be injected if used by a drug. So this includes different like polypeptides, glycoproteins, catecholamines like norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine. And they also will act then to pass through the plasma membrane by acting through a second messenger system within their target tissue. And so these must circulate mainly dissolved in the plasma. And then we have the lipophilic or nonpolar, and so these are water insoluble, however they are lipid loving, and so these are often called lipophilic hormones because they also are nonpolar. So these can enter target cells directly because they can easily diffuse across the plasma membrane, and these include our steroid hormones, our thyroid hormones, as well as melatonin. And these can be taken orally in pill forms, and what they do is they directly activate genes when binding to receptors within the cell nucleus of that target tissue. And these typically tend to be larger in size, so they are bound to plasma proteins as well to help with travel. So how a cell responds will depend on the amount of hormone and then also the combination of all hormones. And there are three different modalities in which hormones work. So the first one is antagonistic, and this is where hormones are going to work in opposite directions, and a great example of this is insulin and glucagon, and how they both affect adipose tissue in different directions. So insulin will stimulate fat storage, whereas glucagon will stimulate fat breakdown. Another modality is synergistic, and this is where the effects may be additive, such as when epinephrine and norepinephrine will affect the heart in a similar fashion. And so these effects may be complementary, as when each hormone contributes a different piece of an overall outcome. So one example of this too is when producing milk for lactating women, this requires estrogen, prolactin, and oxytocin, all three to produce milk for that new infant. Okay, and then the last modality is permissive, and so this is when we have one hormone makes the target cell more responsive to a second hormone. And so, for example, exposure to estrogen makes the uterus more responsive to progesterone. And another example would be like an increased secretion of parathyroid hormone will make the intestines more responsive to vitamin D3 and calcium absorption. The way that hormones travel will be through blood, but depending on what type of hormone will matter as to how it travels within the bloodstream. So hydrophilic or lipophobic hormones, such as the peptide and catecholamines, which are water soluble, are going to bind with specific receptors on the outer side of the plasma membrane, and they'll be transported dissolved in blood. Lipophilic or hydrophobic hormones, such as the steroid and thyroid hormones, will pass through the surface membrane and bind directly to receptors located inside of the cell. And so these are going to circulate in blood-brown proteins, and so they make up this free hormone complex, and then they'll have this large binding protein and then make a protein hormone complex. Both of these mechanisms are highly specific, and they will either bind to receptors and will bind to receptors with a high affinity. Lipophilic hormones, which we have here, such as steroid hormones and those thyroid hormones, travel to target cells attached to these carrier proteins. And so at the target cell, they dissociate from the carrier protein and will diffuse across that plasma membrane, which here we have outlined in the blue. And so the receptors then are found within the nucleus, and so here's our nucleus, and are called nuclear hormone receptors because then they activate gene transcription. So these hormone receptors serve as transcription factors where they are activated by the binding of that hormone and then can activate then changes in gene activity within that nucleus. Hydrophilic hormones, which we have here, include, again, like protein hormones and a lot of our catecholamines. So these hormones, again, cannot cross the plasma membrane, so they have to bind to receptors that are found within and on that cell membrane, so what we see here. And so these will activate an intracellular pathway, which is called a second messenger system. And so this second messenger system then will continue and generate a response and then have changes like within enzyme activity and then have a cellular response for that cell, but this is occurring within that cytoplasm. Hormone effects are proportional to their plasma concentration, and so the plasma levels will be regulated by changes in secretion of hormones, changes in rate of activation of hormones, also by alteration and expression of carrier molecules, and also by altered metabolism, which can actually deactivate some hormones. Also, there can be a modulatory response where this can alter the receptor number for which the hormone can bind, and also the receptor coupling, which can affect then the second messenger system. So other things that will affect it too include like neurotransmitters from hormone, where we have this neuroendocrine response. And so particularly within the central nervous system, the hypothalamus has a great influence, as well as the pituitary gland, on the amount of hormone secretion, as well as with the autonomic nervous system, which is primarily from the adrenal medulla found within the kidneys. And so other hormones can also affect secretion, such as tropic hormones, and these stimulate secretion of other hormones. And so due to different situations, so like that would be an example of synergistic or permissive effect. However, we can have problems that occur, and so this is called dysfunction of the endocrine system, and these can be due to a number of different factors. There's no one set way, and also this can have one where it stimulates like this cascade where it continues to affect more and more hormones. And so most common result from abnormal plasma concentrations of hormones are due to inappropriate rates. So there's two main rates. We have hyposecretion, which is too little hormone, and then hypersecretion, which is too much hormone. So with hyposecretion, again, this is when we have too little hormone, and this is due to problems within the gland itself. And so many causes can occur from this, including genetics, dietary influence. So for example, with hypothyroidism, that's when a lot of times there's not enough iodine within the diet, and so goiters are a symptom of that. And so that has been combated though with putting iodine in salt, and so the hypothyroidism has been on the decrease. Also, there's chemical and toxic exposures within the environment, immune problems, other diseases such as different cancers, and also with hypersecretion, again, this is where we have too much hormone that's being produced. And so causes of this include tumors, where they continuously secrete excessive hormone, so they ignore the negative feedback that our bodies typically set up for and maintains homeostasis. So this is more like in a positive feedback fashion. Also, differences in immunity can affect and cause hypersecretion. With primary hypersecretion, this is when too much hormone is secreted due to problems with the gland itself. And then secondary hypersecretion, this is when the gland causes oversecretion due to too much stimulation due to outside of the gland.